Why do animations like this one suck? We got great animations out there, transition frames, fluid movements, straight up funny animations. But frankly, I'm not that good at this stuff. And so if I don't expect myself to make something great, I can at least try and figure out what makes an animation terrible. So that my animation can have that homemade kind of quirkiness to it, where it's kind of disfigured but still has some charm. So how do we get our animation to look correct? Well, we should probably go step by step. We start with bobbing the head up and down in a sine-like movement. Then we add the leg movement, and then lastly we animate the arms. And to keep track of which arm is in front and which arm is in the back, we can color them separately. To make sure we get the type of frame that looks the best, there will be plenty of things to look out for. Since we will repeat the entire run cycle, any frame that is slightly too different will stand out. But all of this is tricky, and we just want to ensure that our animation isn't bad. So as a starter, I think it can be good to reference other animations and do something similar, but for your own character. There are plenty of animations out there that you can refer to get the basic movement correct, and it's probably the best way to get a decent result without having to learn all the theory. And if you haven't done animations before, you will inevitably fail and it will look something like this, or this. This animation has actually kind of followed the process I outlined, and in that sense it's kind of correct, but it still looks bad. Why? Well, for one, it looks a bit jagged. This can be fine for a lot of games, where having few frames makes the movement feel quick and responsive. Like in Gato, there are very few frames, but it still works. Same goes for 8 doors, few frames, but it still looks good. However, in this animation, I'm adding enough frames to make it look like I'm trying to make a fluid movement, but I'm not inserting enough frames to make it look fluid, so it just looks bad. Easy fix, we just add more frames, right? But before we do that, there's something else that makes this animation look bad. The character feels off. Here he's this kind of puffy, soft looking guy, but when he's running, he's suddenly all muscular. It's extremely important to send the same message. In this animation in Wonder Boy, the dragon looks kind of chubby in its idle animation, and still kind of chubby when running. In Ori, it's kind of thin and agile when standing still. That same idea is sold when it's running. But this is not just important when it comes to body, but also the message we want to sell with the character. If we look at 8 doors, we have this grumpy looking character, and when she's running, that same message is being conveyed. The face is frowning and the character is leaning a lot, with the really strong arm movements, making the character look determined in her movements. And while selling the idea for the character really well, like they have in 8 Doors and Guacamelee, might be difficult, we can still make sure not to send conflicting ideas for the character. If the character has a rugged pose in idle, then it should have a rugged pose when running. And if we have a quite unassuming pose in idle, like in Momodora, that is kept consistent when running, where it just looks like a fairly standard run. Now there is a small problem here. For our animation, the idle makes the character feel a bit insecure perhaps, but if we go all out like they have in Limbo and make the character's running animation feel too awkward, then we also expect the controls to feel a bit awkward. So I think the main thing we should do is go for a fairly standard run, but still make the character look a bit puffy. So we aren't striving for perfectly consistent, just making sure to avoid the extremes of a conflicting message. Prioritizing character consistently is important, but it should probably not come at the expense of game feel. And if we want our game to be a fluid and smooth platformer, we probably need the character to look fairly fluid. The animation in Limbo largely works because the controls themselves are somewhat janky, but we can see the value of a fluid animation in games like Dead Cells. The character feels super responsive and nice to control, which is in part thanks to how well designed the controls are, but the animation also matches those controls, making the overall experience fantastic. So when we're animating this character, I think we should remove all the athletic elements and make the character slightly thicker, but we keep the agile run cycle to match the controls of the game. Now we have an animation that runs fairly decently. We just need to add some small things, like the mark on the chest to make the character feel a bit more 3D, and then we need to add the tail. We also add some small flaps to the ears that don't technically make sense, but if we play the animation, it kinda works. The character still looks a bit awkward, but it will most likely still feel responsive in game. All of this falls into understanding the game that you're making. There's a great sense of realism and atmosphere in a game like Ghost Song, so the animation is fairly realistic and subdued. At the other extreme we have games like Hue, which is simple and a bit quirky, and the animation conveys that exact message. All in all, I would personally say that the quirkier you make your animation, the more forgiving the audience will be in terms of correctness. We can see this particularly well in games with rigged animation. Look at a game like Cuphead, we can see how the shoulders and arms swing back and forth as the character runs. This is how people run, and if we hand animate our movement, we can do this fairly well. For my mushroom character, this same principle applies. Half the cycle we see the chest, half the cycle we see the back of the character. It makes the character look a bit more 3D. But when you rig your character, this can be tricky to achieve since you're working with static images, so a lot of games just skip it altogether. Look at SteamWorld Dig, which has an excellent animation in many ways, but if we look at what's happening to the chest and arms, the character is consistently leaning towards the camera. It makes the character look a bit wonky and unrealistic. This still works quite well in a game like SteamWorld Dig, because it fits the style. In Adventure Plus, they've almost leaned into it with an even greater exaggeration of this unrealistic movement. But once again, the game is quirky, so it works. But take a look at Tales of Iron. It wants to look dark and somewhat realistic, so this odd quirky lean towards the camera would suddenly become awkward. Instead, they have increased the degree to which we can see the character in profile. So we look at the character from straight to the side. Instead of this, we get this. And now the character runs with very little shoulder movement. It's a bit stiff, but it looks correct. In Ghost Song it works even better since the character is a bit robotic and stiff. It just adds to the atmosphere. All in all, an animation that is technically incorrect can still work if we just match it with a quirky style. A bad animation is sometimes bad because we try to sell the idea of something complex but then fail at it. But if we sell the idea of something odd and funny, the incorrectness can accentuate that. This is taken to the extreme in Rogue Legacy, where the animation is incredibly incorrect from a realistic standpoint, but it's entertaining to look at. We don't see this and think that they can't animate, we see it and recognize that it's intentional. Personally, however, I simply don't like this look. One of the reasons I really prefer a hand animation is because how much easier it is to get a bit of a 3D look. In both of these animations, the movement that we're getting is by no means perfect. In fact, we can argue that it's somewhat bad, but it does look less flat than this. If we think about it, it's still kind of odd that the character is looking towards the camera. But if we look around, this seems to be the case in all games. From Hollow Knight to Iconoclast, the character consistently looks towards the camera. When we as humans run, we don't do this, so why do we do it in games? The biggest reason is to make the character look 3D. If the character is entirely in profile, the character looks flat. But more than that, we want to make sure the transition from left to right looks good. And this is where we have to talk a bit about transition frames. Let's take a quick look at Have a Nice Death and see what happens when the character turns. Did you catch it? Instead of just flipping the animation from one side to the next, they threw an extra frame in there, where we see the character almost looking towards the camera. That extra frame makes the character turn feel significantly more fluid, but it can come at a cost. If we add too many frames, it can make the game feel less responsive. This is still fairly common to do in hand-drawn games. Hollow Knight has the same thing. The character turns and there we have an extra frame, making the transition smoother. Gris takes this even further and adds different frames depending on which frame the character transitions from, but I think this is over the top. In fact, there's something I'm not entirely sure I like about this transition in Gris. The transition frame changes the silhouette of the character significantly, so it sometimes brings attention to itself, and doesn't quite make it look as fluid in my opinion. But personally I love the animation of Gris, and in terms of animation I think it sticks out above the rest. For my animation I want to start with adding 2 frames. One transition from idle to running. It's a really small shift, but I think it adds to the movement overall. And then 1 frame for the flip. But we can see that when we make this transition frame from left to right, it doesn't feel that smooth. Nowhere near as smooth as the transition from idle to running. Well, this is a perfect example of why it can be important to not rely on your non-existent animation skills. The reason it doesn't look fluid is because the head is flipped. If we make our head transition just be a small adjustment and then we flip, then it looks fluid, as if there's some initial inertia, but then a rapid turn. And in a game it works as well. It doesn't look too bad. It's by no means perfect, but it's a bit cleaner than what we started with. I want to point out here that you can and might actually want to learn this stuff. I do recommend reading The Illusion of Life, The Animator's Survival Kit, and then Game Anim. And if you don't like reading books, you can search for the 5 fundamentals of game animation and the 12 principles of animation. And if you want to do brilliant stuff, it's probably good to learn these things. But for most of us, we just want to make sure that our animation isn't terrible. And that is in part what I want to point out. I can almost leave this animation kind of rough. The legs are not entirely consistent over the movement. In some frames the leg is thin, in others it's slightly thicker. Some frames look anatomically off, but when we see the movement as a whole, I'm not sure we think about it too much. This animation isn't brilliant like Hollow Knight's, it's not even great, but at least it's not as terrible as before, and that's good enough for me. Thanks for watching. Bye.